Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today's video is a very late one, y'all. I mean, like, this video was originally meant to come out, if I'm not mistaken, in like May or something like that. I think the original episode that this was supposed to be was like 242 or something like that, and it is now 251. And then you have to consider that I took the entire month of June off from making content, so it's been a little while since the video was originally supposed to come out. Whenever the Sun Eater Rereadathon announcement video came out, that was supposed to be this one originally. But a variety of factors, all amounting to just kind of being busy, prevented my reading the book on time to be able to make that video and release it then. So I finally got to circle back around to the book in the end of June while I was on my content hiatus, and now we are here. That means it is finally time to talk about the book that I don't even have next to me for some reason, because I did the thumbnail like 2 months ago. The Dead Zone by Stephen King, which is honestly a really great book. This is my first Stephen King review in I think like 9 months. I did not intend for it to take that long, but anyway, we are here, so let's get into it. We shall start off this review with the good of the book, just as I typically would do. The main thing that I can shout out about The Dead Zone that I personally absolutely loved is the stereotypical praise that King gets in almost any book he writes, character work. Where the plot is a little bit hard to properly summarize, the characters feel often like the primary drivers of the book and the primary drivers of the story, instead of feeling like you have characters that are contained within a plot that King has crafted arbitrarily, and therefore they have to do the things that the characters need to do to make that plot do what it does. You instead feel like you have a whole cast of characters who are wholly their own actual people, and actual cast of characters that are just genuinely unique, very breathtaking, very believable, and real, and those characters drive their own stories. And that was a fascinating read for this book. I mean it when I say that this might be the best of King's character work that I have personally read. The only exception to that might be The Shining. Even The Dark Tower does not compare to this for me, and The Dark Tower has several books to get you connected to characters. The character work in The Dead Zone is just so good and gets you so invested in what feels like genuinely real people. It's just kind of unbelievable to me just how good it is. Every character, like I said, does feel like a real living being with all of their own motivations, all of their own desires, their own drives that push the story forward, so that the plot that is here feels more coincidental than intended. And by coincidental, I don't necessarily mean that it feels haphazard or unplanned, because very clearly it was. There are some scenes in the first part of the book, or the first 2/3 of it, that feel like they don't have really much of anything to do with the story until you get into part 2, and then you realize that those kind of other scenes actually do have a pretty major role in the story, but you also just had to get through a lot of Johnny Smith's character work in the first part to really make it make sense. But quite frankly, I just thought that everything about the characters was great. And as an additional point to the character work of The Dead Zone, I have to say that the depiction of humanity amongst the characters is very diverse and similarly pretty great. You have misguided zealots and agnostics, you have corrupted people versus very straight and narrow people. You also have some grieving people and some other people who seem pretty unbothered by stuff. Just a whole wide swath and vast variety of characters that fit a whole bunch of different roles, but that don't feel like they're just given a particular trait or a particular condition just for the sake of it, but again, rather because they feel like real people that actually serve a role and serve a purpose in their own story, not just this story. To go along with that, there's a whole range of emotional connection that you can feel with various different characters here. There are some that are so emotionally disconnected from themselves that they're just psychopaths. There are some actual psychopaths in here, but there are also some very deeply human people with very real and meaningful emotions that are kind of subvert a little bit of your expectations a bit. Suffice it to say, there are some truly horrible people, some really innocent people, those who are just simply doing their best, those who could hardly care less, and just so much more that it's kind of hard to recall them all. There's a pretty solid amount of people in this book, but none of them feel underserved. They're just all really good. I think that if you enjoy characters and character work, if you're a character first person to any degree at all, this is by far the book for you. That was definitely the standout highlight moment for me, and really the reason that I loved the book so much. And another point that I guess I kind of forgot to mention as well is that with all of these characters having their own motivations, their own drives, their own personalities, their own purposes that they fulfill within their own worlds, you also get to see a lot of like actual interactions between characters that make more sense than just, like I said, plot momentum. There's legitimate disagreements between people who fundamentally do not agree on certain points, and you get to see some of that raw human emotion as a result of that. This book definitely has that in spades, and never once did I ever feel King's hand in the writing of the book as an author with these characters. They just felt like real people guiding themselves along. You remember when I said something earlier about King kind of subverting expectations to a degree? Well, I felt like the plot of this book subverted a little bit of the expectation as far as Johnny's character goes. It talks about how he has some manner of prescience, and dealing with a character that has prescience or foresight or the ability to kind of tell some things before they happen, or being able to follow certain things based off of some supernatural energy that they leave off in the world, that kind of plot, that kind of idea could definitely be handled way worse than it was in this book. Some of the plot direction makes predictable sense as a result of some of this characterization, but his reluctance to use the prescience is what sets him apart, I think, from other similar characters. You know, you have him doing these things, but he feels cursed by this power more than anything else, whereas a lot of other characters in this role, you might just predictably have them going power mad or power hungry or purposely doing the best that they can with it or whatever, and Johnny's just like, I want no part of this, you know? So that kind of makes him a little bit more human to me, to kind of tie into that character work. Furthermore, the way that certain aspects of the prescience and character action manifest is pretty unexpected at certain points in the book, especially the ending. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this book, and that is largely disconnected from any of the character stuff that I've praised to this point, which has been a lot, I know, the politics of the Dead Zone are actually pretty good and pretty engaging. I've heard some mixed things on this book from some people, like, oh, it's a political book or whatever the case, and I'd argue the people that make that statement are usually making it in a pretty uncharitable way. This is definitely not a case of King just inserting his own beliefs for no reason at all, or for no good reason anyway. The political references that appear in the Dead Zone come more as like a pop culture type of thing, more as like a world building detail that supports some of the character work than making any form of statement. For example, Johnny Smith, you know, it says right on the back of the book that he's been in a coma for the last like 4.5 years. At least I'm pretty sure it says that on, yeah, he's been in a coma lasting 4.5 years. Part of what kicks Johnny back into the real world, or rather part of what makes him understand the differences in the world, is by going over some of the changes that have occurred politically, like, oh, the change in the presidency or certain things like that. It's like, oh, Nixon and Watergate happened? That's unbelievable. So you have more of a set dressing effect with the political comments of the Dead Zone, and never like King is just making a point. There are certain characters that make certain minor political points, but none of them ever feel like they're trying to make a point. They once again just feel like characters saying a thing. For example, there's one comment that I sent to a friend pretty early on because I just thought it was funny. Because it was funny, I was like, yeah, this is totally worth sharing. I laughed out loud at it, and I'm not the type of person to typically laugh out loud at things. If I could ever find that message, there we go. Here's the quote, and the quote is in reference to why the kids aren't all right, or why the kids are kind of unruly nowadays. Nowadays being the like early or mid, yeah, early 70s, something like that. Anyway, the quote says, Well, they ate a bad hot dog called Vietnam, and it gave them promaine. A guy named Lyndon Johnson sold it to them. So they went to this other guy, see, and they said, Jesus, mister, I'm sick as hell. And this other guy, his name was Nixon. He said, I know how to fix that. Have a few more hot dogs. And that's what's wrong with the youth of America. Is that making a political statement that is really, like, offensive? Not really. It's just kind of funny, you know? And sure, that particular quote is from King the narrator and not from a particular character. But again, it's just funny, so I didn't feel like anything was being shoved down my throat. It felt more like set dressing than anything else. And maybe that's just because nearly 50 years separate the writing of this book, or rather the references being made, compared to now. But either way, I just thought that the political stuff was an engaging way to, you know, characterize a little bit of the setting where you otherwise would have had to rely on some other things. As a way to sell the character having been in a coma, this was definitely a good way to do it, and I enjoyed it. So there's that. Let's talk about the bad. The first thing that I want to talk about in the bad is that it's kind of hard to actually say what the book is without just reading the back of the book, and I'm one of those people that never reads the backs of books. I kind of went into this having no idea what it was because I didn't read the back of the book, and after a little while, like I would say the first 50 pages, I did read the back of the book just to kind of see what it said, and it still doesn't even really give you a great idea of what the book actually is. But part of that's because it's more character forward than it is plot forward specifically. It's a book about a guy who ends up in a coma for a little while and comes out of it with some pretty heavy amount of prescience. He then has to find his way in the world with this maybe gift, ? And that's basically the entire setup that you can give without just straight up telling entire parts of the plot directly. Beyond that summarization, this book is primarily about character work, and some people maybe aren't going to be super into that. In that way, if you're a plot-forward reader, if you primarily read for plot and you don't really care about characters at all, this book probably won't do it for you because the vast majority of it is character-focused. And quite frankly, a lot of what Stephen King does is character-focused. So if you're a plot-forward reader, there's not a ton of King's books, at least in my experience so far, that are going to really work for you directly. But if you're in for a journey with Johnny Smith and the toppling of a couple of bad guys, this book is a way better time than I expected based off of, you know, a couple of people that I had heard from. But I guess for me, there's just a couple of things that I felt like were minor complaints. One minor thing that I believe I kind of mentioned offhand in like my little precursor to a Goodreads review is that there was one thing that I wanted to see maybe wrapped up a little bit better. The back of the book also mentions that when Johnny Smith was 6 years old, he had a head trauma caused by a bad ice skating accident. There is aspects of this accident that are mentioned at various points in the book, but it never really feels like it's as important as the book tries to make it out to be. Like, it's implied that this accident is pretty important and clearly has something to do with his prescience, but the reality of what that actually has to do with the prescience and, you know, how that's resolved in any way in the book is not really done very satisfied. It was the only true bummer of the book for me, was I wanted the explanation for what in the world the head trauma and the prescience has to do with anything. Didn't really get wrapped up, and that was like the only plot point, I guess, that I kind of wish that there was a little bit more to. Otherwise, I could see being somewhat unhappy with the ultimate ending of the book. This was not a problem I had, but, you know, the stereotypical funny haha Stephen King writes bad endings, whatever. It doesn't really matter to me. I just legitimately think that there are going to be some people who read this book that won't love part 2, or at least the back half of part 2, if nothing else, and thus the ending that it builds up towards is something that's a little bit different than I feel like you might expect based off of the first like 2/3 or the first 3/4 or something like that with Johnny's character. There's just a couple decisions that are made that not everybody's going to be into. In fact, I can't say I was in love with part 2 as much as I was with part 1, but it was still pretty engaging, and even though the ending was somewhat unexpected, I still found it to be pretty powerful and really good nonetheless. It was good in its own way rather than good in the way that I was kind of expecting it to be. So it's not like it's a bad ending, but I think some people are going to not like it. Finally, the only other thing that I would comment on the bad, and this isn't necessarily a knock on King directly, is just that after reading a whole ton of Christopher Rocchio's prose, let's say that jumping immediately into Stephen King with The Dead Zone was a little bit of whiplash. It definitely caused a little bit of whiplash jumping into that. Not like it's bad prose, it totally works for what it is. It's just different, and that kind of felt funny to me. But as for the ugly of The Dead Zone, this is nothing new for Stephen King fans. I think if you're going into a Stephen King book, you kind of need to expect for there to be some trigger warning of some sort in a lot of those books. At least in the early books, there's mention or some scenes that are dealt with in some ways pretty candidly that maybe some potential readers aren't going to be a fan of. So if you're somebody who's just really sensitive to, the whole slew of random trigger warnings, you probably shouldn't be reading very much of Stephen King in the first place. But this book is one of, somewhat note. If you dislike animal violence, if you dislike depictions of sexual violence, if you really dislike crude vulgarity, you should not be reading any Stephen King book at all. But this book is of particular note in a couple of sections. This may bother you at points in this book, but like I said, this is not really much of anything new for Stephen King, but it is worth pointing out. When you're depicting humanity to the degree that King manages to do here, and characters who feel like actual people, it's inevitable that you're going to cover some pretty dark and nasty topics in the meanwhile, because there are actual people that exist on that side of the spectrum. But that brings us to the recommendation of The Dead Zone, and for me, this is a huge recommendation pretty much all around. Aside from some of the trigger warnings that I kind of mentioned, I absolutely loved this book. As far as King's early work is concerned, there's scarcely anything to complain about this book for me. I really enjoyed it. In fact, I think I might even like The Dead Zone more than Salem's Lot, for example. I liked Salem's Lot a lot, but I also think it's a slight bit overrated as far as King's early work is concerned. This is one that does not get brought up into the conversation enough when it comes to his early several books. I don't think enough people talk about it, maybe because it's not horror, where a lot of his other books are horror. This is a really good book, though. I really enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it. So, there you have it, another Stephen King review in the books. I admit, after finishing this book, I really wanted to jump right into another Stephen King book, but alas, Firestarter and Cujo will be read a little bit later in the year. I'm not 100% sure when. They could fill in as I guess, kind of mood reads, or to fill in gaps that I have with time over the next handful of months, but it also might be the last quarter or something of the year where I get to those. We'll see what ends up happening with my schedule. Keep up with my monthly reading wrap-up and TBR videos. You can also keep up with my Fortnite on the Isle videos to know a little bit more about what I'm actively reading or what I have actively read in any given month or fortnight or whatever. But I do definitely want to read a couple more King books this year. I've more or less committed myself to at least reading those two by the end of the year so that I can do part 2 of my Stephen King tier list series, and part 3 is going to take forever to come out even after that, but I only have those last 2 books to get to with it. What did you think of The Dead Zone? Let me know in the comments below. I would really be interested to hear, given how little I feel like this is talked about in comparison to some of his other early novels. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. I'll see you guys next week for another special scripted review for the Book Binge. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe, and you can call me KC. I hope to see you guys in the next video.